Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Don Lemon Show. So glad you could join us. I think you're going to love my next guest coming up, because between Gaza, Israel, the massive wave of college protests sweeping the nation, not to mention the former president's hush money trial happening here in Manhattan, it's already shaping up to be a really big news week. To talk through all of it, I'm joined today by political commentator, host of the David Pakman Show. Of course, it would be David Pakman because the show bears his name. David, good to see you. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
So let's start with the upcoming election, and I want to talk about President Biden and President Trump. They are now in a statistical tie. It's unbelievable to me considering what's happening with the former president. Nationally, with Trump polling ahead in almost every single battleground, say this weekend CBS released a poll, shows that Trump is winning in Michigan by 1%. What do you think, what does this due to? Is it the college protest? What is it?
I think a couple of things are going on. It's so boring to say it, but we still have to wait to really get a sense of where this is going to shake out. I think after we get through the conventions and people are really paying attention, political strategist Rachel Bidikofer says that Labor Day is when you're really going to start to see November reflected in the polling. There's another aspect to this which is interesting, which is over time, when you introduce the third-party candidates, Jill Stein, Cornel West, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the degree to which introducing them hurts Joe Biden has been diminishing. And you can actually find polls now where when you add the third-party candidates, it's worse for Trump. And this makes a lot of sense, both because of the way RFK is running, but also because he's not actually going to be on the ballot, maybe almost anywhere. And there are people who are showing up in the polling as supporting a third-party candidate, not knowing in November they'll show up. That person's name won't actually be on the ballot. They'll say, wait, do I write them in or what do I do? Maybe not. So I think that third party is going to shrink as we close in on November. But here's like the big takeaway. You can find 100 people to give you 150 predictions of what's going to happen.
Yeah.
It'll almost certainly come down to under 500,000 votes in fewer than 5 states. Yeah. 2020 came down to 110,000 votes in 3 states. And that means that things that haven't even happened yet are very likely to, on the fringes, make a difference. And it's going to be extraordinarily close electorally, almost certainly. You will almost certainly have a big popular vote win for the president and an electoral college that'll flip based on 250,000, maybe 500,000 votes in some key states.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, because if you look at the national polls, it shows that, the current president is actually gaining some traction, right? But it's just in those key battleground states where it seems that at this point, and listen, polling is a snapshot in time, and whether you believe it or not, because if you look at the polling back in 2021, as it relates to the economy, people thought the economy was awful and Donald Trump wasn't doing a great job with the economy. And then if you ask them now, they'll say, oh, the economy was great under Trump and it's not so great under Joe Biden. So, what gives here, David?
Yeah, so the economy is an interesting one because it's a bit of a lagging indicator. What we saw was that as all economic indicators were looking pretty good, and when I say this, just so your audience knows, I'm not claiming we've solved every economic problem in the world. I'm not saying there's no more homelessness or no more poverty or inequality. By the measures that are usually used to determine how's the economy doing. Unemployment has been very low for a sustained period of time. GDP growth is fine. Inflation has come way down. Every indicator looks pretty good. It takes a little while for that to filter through to public opinion. And interestingly, there are polls that ask people, how do you think the economy's doing? And they say, so-so. Then you say, how are you doing financially? And they go, I'm doing fine. And so part of it is the sense that it's catching up, that actually a lot of people are doing as well as you or your neighbor or whoever might be doing. Still many problems to solve. But in general, when the economy looks the way it looks right now, presidents running for re-election tend to get re-elected. That's the historical story.
I mentioned the CBS polling. Another part of that polling says most Americans seem not to care all that much about the president's hush money trial, particularly in swing states. It's interesting because I don't know. I think the TV ratings show that people aren't tuning in as much, which is surprising to me considering what's on the line. And, we've never had a president or a sitting president or former president in this position. But why do you think that is, that these folks just don't really care?
Couple things going on. The trial is not televised. It would make for extraordinary television with Donald Trump sleeping and the entire thing. Visually, it would be interesting. That's not happening. So then you get to, all right, there's no entertainment value to watching it day to day. A lot of people think Trump's guilty, but they're already not voting for him. A lot of people don't care whether Trump's guilty, but they're definitely voting for him. So you have to think about this in terms of constituencies. And it's who in the states that it might make a difference in, because it doesn't matter if Biden wins California by an extra 500,000 votes.
Right.
He's still getting its 55 electoral votes. In the states where it matters, are there people who will be swayed by the outcome of the trial? Polling says there are some, something like close to 80% of the country said they wouldn't vote for a convicted Trump. But at the same time, a lot of this is irrelevant in the sense that many people are almost completely of a mind that they're either definitely voting for the guy or definitely not. And so why tune in to something that's irrelevant in that way?
I always think it's more important to look forward than backwards, but this one I haven't had a chance to speak to you about this. The last time we spoke, it was about other things leading up to the trial. And so now that, you know, David Pecker is taking the stand, he's laid out this whole hush money thing, the timeline and why they were doing it. What do you make? Who do you think, I don't know, did the prosecution make any headway by calling David Pecker first? What do you make of what's happened with the trial so far?
What the legal experts say is you shouldn't try to, nor is it possible to win the trial with your first witness.
Yeah.
But I think the most important part about Pecker's testimony is it does paint the bigger picture that they were engaged in exactly the type of general activity that Trump said previously they were not engaged in, that they were both floating and signal boosting positive stories about Trump and helping to generate negative story about Trump's opponents. It wasn't just related to
which
this
is not
particular
illegal.
incident.
Which is
not
not
illegal, not
yeah.
against the law. No,
Yeah.
no, not against the law. So now that that's been established, and you also have Michael Cohen's previous testimony in other trials, which won't come in here, but of course Michael Cohen is a witness here as well. It's setting up a situation where anyone who says that this isn't what was going on is pretty transparently going to be lying. And so I think that the environment that's been created is this generally does seem like it's what was happening. Now you have to explain to the jury what are the crimes and why it's against the law.
Yeah. I watch and I'm like, his attorneys really have a tough job because he doesn't really want them to paint him as someone who did something wrong knowingly, right? They can say, listen, our client did this, but you know, it's not illegal. It may be scummy, right? But he doesn't want that to happen. So it's really tricky to have David Blanche, you know, trying to really defend him. It's a tough job.
There's no doubt, and sometimes Trump's lawyers don't even get paid. So I hope these guys at least are getting paid.
Well, let's hope so, because this guy, Blanche, left a really good job and put his reputation on the line. So let's see. Let's talk about another case, right? The Supreme Court now. This is the one that really has my attention. As I listened to the oral arguments the other day, I was shocked. It seemed like the conservative justices were trying to find a way to justify what Trump's attorneys were bringing. Maybe that is just my assessment. I thought they would just say, this is ridiculous. You can't have a former or current president immune to everything, because then what gives? They could just get away with anything. This is a dictatorship. We'd have a dictatorship. But it seems like the justices are taking it seriously, and some of them are trying to make excuses to rule in favor of the former president.
Well, I think anytime you try to guess what the decision will be in the Supreme Court based on listening to the oral arguments, it's a little bit fraught. We can try to read the tea leaves, but I think it's tough. There's a very interesting recent Rolling Stone article that says that within Trump's camp, they don't really expect to win this, but that the whole point is use this as a delay tactic to push another trial beyond the election, with the idea that it would be more damaging to Trump. And then also, if he does become president, then he can start his now is not the right time for this reason, then it won't be the right time because he'll be president, and so on and so forth. So the Rolling Stone article argues that they already see it as a victory. They may end up getting some kind of partial immunity decision, unlikely that it will be total, but that it would be a win regardless because of what it does to the timeline.
Well, that was my next question. Do you think they're going to delay this? Because it seems to me, I mean, they denied. Jack Smith said, will you take the case? They said no, and then they delayed it until April. If they are really just sort of trying to delay this case, postpone it so that they won't have to make a judgment on it, and then say it's too close to the election, we can't do it, then he'll be in office, and then maybe he'll be immune to it. Who knows? Or maybe he'll
Yeah,
just...
I think that's part of it. And I think just in general, there's been a lot of statements made about, Trump saying the indictments came out at exactly the time that it was calculated it would be the most damaging to me. They could have done this before, they could have done this later.
Yeah.
It's not really true with regard to all of these cases. Some of the stuff happened, some of the alleged bad acts are recent enough that you would expect it to actually take a little bit longer. Some of these could have been maybe brought earlier, but the point I want to make is it's not really obvious to me what would be the most damaging moment for Trump. Would it be for the trials to be in September, October rather than now? Is a delay good for Trump? Is it not? It's very difficult. Trump's assuming everyone is picking the exact dates to do these things to hurt him, but it's kind of all over the map, and it's not obvious to me that this is the worst time.
Well, September, October, I mean, that's, now you're getting into James Comey territory, right, with 2016. Yes. So I think that they may even have, I think they might even have a case, meaning the Trump folks and the attorneys saying, this is way too close. So that may actually work in their favor. That is just me. I am guessing that. I do not know. But I am surprised, though, that the Supreme Court is, I'm surprised that they just didn't say this is absolutely ridiculous, because if they do rule, or if they do make a judgment on it before the election, then that would mean that Joe Biden would be immune to everything. Joe Biden could say, you know what, I'm not leaving, or he could have his political opponent, I'm just speaking, this is hypothetical here, have his political opponent taken out, and he would be immune to it. So they're actually arguing that the current president would be immune to doing illegal things, and that may hurt Donald Trump.
Yeah, not only that, I mean, first of all, there's the obvious point you're bringing up, which is if indeed what Trump's lawyers are arguing about Trump applies to all presidents, if you can make the case, I mean, it was made by Trump's lawyer in those arguments, if President Biden determined that Trump was truly a corrupt person and a danger to American democracy, if as a part of his official duties as president, he ordered Trump assassinated, in this framework, Biden would be immune if he were to do that. So there's that. There's also all of the going after Biden for the alleged crimes for which they can find no evidence. It all also becomes moot if there's total and complete immunity, because it would also apply to Biden. Now, they have a counterpoint to that, Don, which is some of that stuff was allegedly from before when Biden was president. But again, even with the Trump stuff, some of these acts are from after Trump being out of office as well.
Yeah. I want to talk about something something I found interesting, especially after the White House Correspondents' Dinner this weekend. I thought that the current president did a good job. I'm not sure if you heard him on Howard Stern. I thought he did a good job on Howard Stern. Of course, we have the State of the Union. I think the folks in conservative media are actually helping the president. They think they're doing him a disservice by saying, he's cognitively in decline and he can barely walk, he can barely talk, or whatever. And then every time he comes out and does something, because the bar is so low, he knocks it out of the park. So it actually makes him look better. I think they're actually helping him when they don't realize it.
I think you're absolutely right. And when the expectations are Biden doesn't know what day it is. He has to be helped, and he's wearing geriatric sneakers all over the place, and he just can't do anything. He doesn't know anything. And then he does a perfectly reasonable a State of the Union address. He does a 75-minute interview with Howard Stern, during which, listen, it was not a hard gotcha interview.
Right.
There were lots of topics favorable to Joe Biden, like, for example, when Howard brings up the instant refunds for canceled flights. I don't know that Howard 20 years ago says that's the top thing I want to bring up, but he brought it up. Maybe it was negotiated with the White House. I don't know. But Biden was extraordinarily sympathetic in terms of his life story, relatable to a great degree. And it's not just the expectations being low. It's, Trump's screaming about how he can't go to Barron's graduation or be with Melania because of a rigged trial where everyone's treating him so unfairly. That the contrast there is a pretty notable contrast.
Yeah. I think it's interesting when he talks about that, I can't be here and I can't be there, but yet and still, David, as we know and as we talked about before, he's going to use the media to his advantage. He's going to walk out of that courtroom every day and give a statement and take questions. He is campaigning at the trial, and he has more media attention by getting in front of those cameras at his own trial than if he were to go to a rally in Dubuque or just anywhere where it's just mostly local people. He knows what he's doing. He's not really off the campaign trail. He could have gone to Barron's graduation. He could have gone, spent some time with his wife or her birthday. By the way, he didn't do it last year if you look at his calendar and social media, but I digress. What do you think? Am I right?
Yeah, and remember, Barron's graduation isn't until later in May, so Trump's actually lying when he says he's not allowed to go. The judge simply hasn't ruled on it yet. He's like, we'll deal with that when we're closer. There's been this idea that any publicity, even bad publicity, is good for Trump's campaign. That definitely seemed true during the primary. It's less clear to me how seeing, this kind of sweaty, bloated, haggard Trump every day, ranting and raving in court, compared to seeing Joe Biden being interviewed by Howard Stern in Pennsylvania with actual union workers rather than fake union workers. I don't know how that contrast right now is going to help Trump in the general. I understood that in the primary. I don't get it right now.
But David, he does look, I have to be honest, just looking at him walking outside of that court without the trappings, of the office and the band and the crowd and the rope line and the Secret Service and all of that, he looks diminished. I think it makes him look small. It's not great lighting, right? He's not portrayed in the most favorable light. I think it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz now. Like, we have seen behind the curtain, and it is not so grand or frightening as we thought.
I think you're absolutely right, and yet it will probably still come down to that 500,000 votes in 5 states, which is scary.
Yeah. Do you think, as considering if they do rule, I don't know if they call ruling, if they do decide that the president is immune, do you think that Biden should consider stacking the court? If they give Trump immunity, that means Biden has immunity.
That it's a pretty serious hypothetical that's tough to grapple with specifically, because I think the most likely outcome is, if anything, Trump gets some level of immunity, but not the total immunity that he's arguing for here. Stacking the court is something I've thought about for a while on its own merits, not in response. But I do think that there would be a significant wave of support for Biden doing that, if indeed that was the decision, combining the Roe v. Wade decision, which, a historically unpopular decision in an environment where more people than ever think that abortion should usually be legal. I think that he would certainly have the political support to do it. Stacking the court is sort of a bigger conversation of its own.
Yeah. Let's talk about the college, what's happening on college campuses, especially in light of what we talked about, just a couple of states, a couple of swing states. Michigan is one of them, right? And Michigan has a very large Arab population, and they're not so happy with the current president on his stance on the war in Israel and Gaza. I'm just wondering what you think about that, if you think it's going to affect the election at all, or Biden's chances of being reelected.
So let me say a couple of things, and I'm sure there will be something in here for everyone to disagree with me about. So first of all, you look at polling. Recent CNN poll says an overwhelming number of 18 to 34-year-olds disapprove of how Joe Biden is handling the war on Gaza. Only 19% approve. Okay. There is no question whatsoever that I am a supporter of free speech that includes on campuses, students coming out and saying, this is my opinion, I don't like what Biden's doing, or I want you to divest from Israel. Not all of the colleges are invested in Israel. I don't know that they all know that, but we can talk. So I think that that is absolutely critical for students to be allowed to do. It's wild to me that authority figures haven't figured out that when you crack down on protest movements, especially with what is seen as too much force, it spawns even larger protests and larger and larger. So it's being handled in an absolutely disastrous way.
And then, hey, one second. And when you see any sign of violence, it's usually with the police present. It looks like they are mishandling the protesters. Sorry to interrupt, but go on.
It sometimes does appear that way. So that's number one. In that sense, even though I may disagree with everything that the protesters allege, the handling of it has been a disaster. Number two, it is also true that there have been, number one, you see some of the interviews with these folks. Some of them straight up say, I don't even know why we're here. There's some clips that went viral. I don't know why we're here. You had some interesting conversations with some of the folks when you went to, I think it was NYU, although maybe you were at Columbia.
NYU.
There are also chants about a song about we love Hamas rockets, stuff about intifada, which they say doesn't allude to violence, but I can't think of a non-violent intifada in Israeli history. And then when some people, Jewish Americans, say, hey, some of this stuff is anti-Semitic, the tone with which some of the Jewish folks are told, no, it's not. I just want to do a thought experiment. Imagine that it was black women who said, hey, something happening here is racist, would the same tone be allowed to say to the black women, no, it's not. This isn't racist. We know whether it's racist or not. So I think that some of you don't even have a right to say that some of this stuff is bordering on anti-Semitic. I think that's also a problem. And then going back to your first question, will this affect the election? Every poll I'm seeing has foreign policy, or if it breaks out Israel-Gaza separately, 10th or lower, sometimes 15th or lower in terms of order of importance overall for the electorate. So I struggle to think it's going to make a difference in November.
But listen, you made me think of something, David. Do you remember the whole Charlottesville Jews will not replace us tiki torch crowd? They applied for a permit, legally got it, and they were able to do their thing legally, express their First Amendment, exercise their First Amendment right to freedom of expression. Sadly, it turned violent, and Heather Heyer ended up dying. But had it not, they had the absolute right, even though they are, we know what they are, and as long as it was not violent, they could continue to do what they were doing. Do you understand where I'm going with this and the protest that's happening on college campuses? Because you brought up the black women. We may not like what they're saying, but as long as they're not inciting violence, what gives here?
I agree completely with you. I'm talking about the issue I take with the protesters isn't their view on Israel-Gaza or that they are protesting. It's more around the fringes. We're seeing the songs of "We Love Hamas" rockets.
Hate speech.
Despicable and disgusting. I'm not saying it should be illegal or anything like that. I'm just telling you what I don't like about it.
Yeah.
I think if it was about the first things we mentioned, absolutely fantastic. The other thing also I think that's important is the things that we can not like about protests aren't necessarily crimes and aren't justifications to shut it down, right? If I were there and they were doing Hamas, "We Love Hamas" rockets, I would say that's absolutely disgusting, but you're not committing a crime, and I don't think police should come and beat you for it.
Yes, but still, I think it is hate speech, and I guess you can do that as long as you're not inciting violence. But I think
the angle that we're missing is what are the rules of each university?
That's what I'm
and
trying
I just
to get
don't
at.
know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
And also the difference. I think you were alluding to when you mentioned the black women of public response, because I think people would be obviously, the majority of folks in this country would be outraged by that, and there should be a majority of outrage when you hear similar language as it relates to Jewish Americans or just Jewish people at all and anti-Semitism. But look, we talked about the law enforcement. Do you think the response from law enforcement has been proportionate, David?
It's so hard to say overall. There have been a bunch of incidents I saw where it seems completely disproportionate. Members of the press and media knocked down, large swaths of individuals who are being, zip-tied and then processed. I do think that I understand the college's desire to separate who are the students and who are not. And so in some of these incidents, it was sort of like zip tie a bunch of people. Anybody who has a student ID, they get to go. Otherwise, you get trespassed. I don't know. I'm not in law enforcement, nor in crowd control, nor in university administration. So I don't know what I'd be doing if I were there. But there are certainly countless incidents that have been filmed, which seem like a completely inappropriate and disproportionate response. Also, when schools have rules that you can't block access to faculty buildings and offices and whatever, there's a logical question of how long will you allow that access to be blocked before you start physically opening up access. I don't know what the rules are at each school, and I understand that.
Well, listen, the epicenter has been Columbia, and that's really where it all started, with them the students building these encampments on campus. And it spread somewhat. Not all campuses have had encampments built. NYU cracked down. I live close to NYU, and it was over in a day. I think they had some protests that got a little bit unruly. They tried to build encampments. NYU shut it down. Columbia is now, they're trying to come up with a timeline, right? A deadline for students to dismantle these encampments. What do you think? They haven't been able to reach a deal with this dismantling of the encampments. How long do you expect this to stretch on for?
I genuinely have no idea. One of the issues is you ask them, well, what are your demands? And you ask 10 people, you get 20 opinions.
Divestment. You say, what is divestment? And they go, well, I'm not really sure.
Yeah, and You know, sometimes the investments are like in Teva Pharmaceuticals through a mutual fund, and Teva does lots of great stuff and
Yeah.
produces products that many of our loved ones have benefited from in pharmaceutical settings. On the other hand, in some places, it's Raytheon and military contractors. I think a lot of these things, knowing people who work in endowment offices at some of, not these universities, but others, these things move really slowly. And so I think the best they could hope to do would be to get some kind of statement that this is something the school will pursue, because they're not going to be, I mean, these divestments wouldn't happen overnight. It just doesn't work that way. So I don't know what they would accept.
Yeah. What about graduations? At least one university said, hey, listen, we're not going to do a graduation. Do you think that is the right call to do online or no commencement ceremony at all?
And if I understand correctly, it's because of the fear that speeches or the events themselves will get out of
USC,
control.
yeah.
Listen, I can't go and say that there's no security concerns whatsoever, but my preference would be that you do the commencements and that you have speakers. And if people don't like what speakers say, then they can use their voices to communicate that. That's always my preference. I always
Same.
want more speech up
I
until
agree.
the point at which we can really demonstrate there's some kind of danger. That's my instinct.
I agree. Listen, you know, you're in the media, you're in independent media. It's always easy. Everyone blames the media. It's the media's fault. How do you think the media has done covering this wave of protests?
I've watched very little of the media coverage. I'm mostly reading about what's going on. I think that it's very hard. Here's what I'll say. I don't think anybody is necessarily going to strike the perfect balance between the absolute right to have voices heard and the importance of supporting free speech, while also being able to say, hey, here's 15 different chants that are absolutely vile and disgusting, and we should also be able to ask how many people here believe in that aspect of this. So I don't know that anyone's striking the exact right balance, quite frankly, because I'm not really watching the audiovisual coverage of it. But I think without question, there are examples of police going too far. There are examples of media coverage that's very one-sided, and all of it could be improved upon.
Last question on this subject. Are you looking forward to this? Meaning, do you think that it will roll over into the Democratic and Republican national conventions this summer?
I am leaning towards no, it won't. But listen, what do I know? I thought Hillary Clinton was going to win in 2016, so I'm not really good at predictions.
I predicted actually the opposite. So, yeah, I didn't want to predict that way, but I did because there are reasons for it, and you know, plenty out there if you want to know why. So let's talk about TikTok, right? I want to pivot now to the president. I almost said Vice President Joe Biden. I don't know, I'm going back years. President Joe Biden, last week he signed into law a bill that would force social media company TikTok to sell or be banned in the U.S. next January. So, I mean, it's been bipartisan, this bill in Congress, but it's been quite controversial to the public. What do you make of the decision to ban TikTok?
I would be surprised if this is actually what happens by January. I think that, first of all, the possibility of appeals may extend that deadline. And then further, ByteDance has said they would rather shut down TikTok in the US than, for example, to be forced to sell and let someone else operate it or something along those lines. My opinion is I don't want to see TikTok specifically targeted. I understand and acknowledge all of the concerns about data privacy and data sharing that potentially are connected with China's involvement, which, by the way, TikTok continues to insist there really is no actual involvement, but there are people on both sides of the aisle that are skeptical. What I would like to see as far as the US is concerned is let's figure out a set of rules that all platforms have to abide by, whether it comes to server co-location, audit abilities when it comes to data, whatever. Figure out what every platform must abide by, have an enforcement mechanism so it actually has teeth, and if anybody doesn't abide by it, whether it's TikTok or Meta or whoever, have some kind of mechanism for enforcing what the rules are. I struggle with just targeting TikTok here because of the China connection. And it hasn't been really satisfactorily demonstrated to me that the worst of what China is being accused of with regard to TikTok is true. I'm as much concerned about China and Russia when it comes to cybersecurity and hacking and all of these things.
Yeah.
But we should have a set of rules all the platforms have to abide by and apply it to everybody.
Yeah. So let's talk about what it means for the election, because I always have to bring it back to that or around to that. I think TikTok is it has a stronger Democratic voting bloc. Young people are typically among the strongest Democratic voting bloc. And then you have the adults under 30 stand out as the least likely to support a ban. 41% oppose a ban, 29% oppose it, and 30% are supported, I should say, and 30% are unsure. So among young people are typically among the strongest Democratic voting blocs. They are on TikTok. Do you think it's going to affect somehow the election come November, i.e. Joe Biden?
Well, when the election is expected to hinge on 500,000 votes in 5 states, any one thing could make a difference. Comey in 2016, right? We can go back and pick any one thing here. So I do think it has the potential to influence to some degree. Interestingly, the folks who recognize me from TikTok are all 55 plus. Just as an interesting little note. I mean, I know it's a platform for young people.
Yeah.
When folks come up to me and say, I watch you on TikTok, it's almost exclusively 55 plus. Yeah. They don't want to see it banned either. But I also think it's important to remember that youngest group is the least likely to vote. Yeah. And so to the extent that they lean Democratic, and they do overall, and to the extent that they're on TikTok, every year it's always, if we can just grow the turnout of 18 to 24, 5%, we win. And then it doesn't happen because it's the least likely age demographic to actually go and vote. You're
going to get in trouble because they hate to, we vote, why are you doing that? Listen, my sister in her 60s, my mom in her 80s, they are both on TikTok. And they'll say, hey, I saw your thing on TikTok, it was great. I'm like, did you watch the show? Not yet, but I saw you on TikTok. Right, so as we get closer to the, so I think you're right about those numbers and about the demographics. As we get closer to November, what do you keep an eye on? Maybe as an indicator as to the way things are swinging. What are you looking at, David?
It is,
and we'll talk, I'm sure, a lot before we get to that.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, right, in late April, early May, it is a lot of looking at the swing states and the momentum. So when I look at the swing state polling, like we talked about earlier, it's less about is Trump +3, but more where is Trump compared to where he was 2 months ago, and what's happening with the third party vote. That poll that has Trump +9, I believe it is. It says 23% of the electorate is going to vote third party in November. I just don't believe it. It says, I think, 3% for Jill Stein, 4% for Cornel West, and then 16 or something like that for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I'd be shocked if RFK Jr. gets 5% at the end of the day. And so what I'm going to be watching is, in those swing states, as we get closer to November, does the third party vote diminish, and where does it go? Does it go to Trump or to Biden? Yeah.
What did you think of Bill Maher's interview with RFK Jr.? I thought he did a pretty good job.
Yeah, by the way, and I saw you on there as well with Scott Galloway, who's going to be on my show soon. It was quite a panel, I would say. Yeah. Listen, I thought it was all totally kind of to be expected. Yeah. The vaccine stuff, I'm kind of tired of. I mean, we have the data on the vaccines. It's just the vaccine part is getting interesting because Trump put out on Truth Social, or Truth Central, as he calls it. He put something out saying RFK is more anti-vax than me even. I wouldn't even go as far as RFK is going. Trump is trying to position himself to the left of RFK on vaccines while saying he's a far left plant. So I think Trump's panicked about the RFK polling numbers.
And doing something similar when it comes to a woman's right. So, yeah. David, always a pleasure. I love watching you, the David Pakman Show, every single day. I watch it. Tune in, like and subscribe, as we say. David, thank you. I'll see you next time.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for watching The Don Lemon Show. Make sure you click on the image in the top right to subscribe to my channel and the thumbnail in the bottom right to watch more content from my show. And I'll see you next time.